Welcome friends to another r/NuclearRevenge video. Today we've got a crazy story of someone getting their hubby locked up behind bars. But first, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons down below so you never miss any of my daily videos. That said, our story of the day is my mother sent her cheating husband to prison. Before I dive in, I want to give you all some background. My mother died approximately 5 years ago, leaving a house along with all of its odds and ends. We had a tempestuous relationship, but nonetheless, I loved and respected her, so her loss knocked me for 6. It was about a year before I could bring myself to sort her things out. When I was sorting through her chest of drawers, I was surprised to find a collection of papers. It was her memoirs. Reading it was like reliving that first moment when you first realize that your parents are not just nurse and cook. I learned entirely new aspects of her life. I've come to regard her as quite the early feminist. It soon occurred to me that such an interesting life would potentially be of interest to the wider public. So I set about tidying it up and preparing it for inspection by a literary agent. I thought it might be a good idea to test the waters first though, so that's why I'm here. I'm going to post an excerpt here, spliced with other parts to give context and gauge public reaction. If the reaction's positive, I'll be able to approach an agent with evidence of its publishing viability. So without further ado, here are one of the powerful parts that she recorded in her memoir. Young girls in my day were supposed to be tender creatures, sweet and chaste. They were supposed to have innocent flirtations with upstanding young chaps living in upstanding little towns, stealing little kisses in private with their beau. That was, in their eyes, living wildly. They must have picked up their ideas of excitement from those sickly sweet films that were so popular at the time. Luckily, it was the 50s, so we at least had rock and roll to shake things up. Meanwhile, I was doing my own shaking with the slim but vigorous farmer who lived down the lane. I used to creep around to the back of the farm and slip into the ramshackle barn on the weekends, where we'd make love. It was terribly exciting, but not in the least comfortable, especially during the colder months. Unfortunately, things came to a rather abrupt finish when on one hot summer afternoon, just as my farmer chap was undoing my corset, my father came storming in. The sly bugger had cottoned onto my habits and followed me. He went ballistic and punched the man, indignated that his daughter's innocence was being sullied. Oh, father, how late to the party you were. Needless to say, my parents sought to set me straight. But how? At 18, I'd left school 3 years prior, and in society's eye, was a young woman. Their solution was to arrange for me to be married. Oh, even in the 1950s, the art of arranging marriage was old hat and simply ghastly. So there was no way I was to be persuaded. At first, my parents threatened to send me off to live with Great Aunt Mary if I didn't acquiesce. Gosh, I thought, what a fearsome idea. Mary, you see, was a stern old spinster. She was dirt poor and survived on a small stipend granted by my parents. In return, she occupied the position of terrifying ghoul brought out only to terrify young children into good behavior. I decided to call my parents' bluff and see what happened. They changed tactics by appealing to my indisputable sense of independence. If I agreed, they said, they would provide me with a modest monthly allowance continuing after marriage, so I may continue to be footloose, if not fancy-free. I considered this offer in earnest and concluded it might not be a bad idea. The marriage would likely be a loveless one, purely practical, and so I may continue to have my dalliances. Having a stable income and no parental interference were bonuses, so I accepted. My parents were delighted and set about finding me a suitable partner. They chose a vicar, they told me. I recoiled. I had a vision of a withering elderly man with fewer teeth than your average pigeon. My parents evidently realized my initial fear and found it endlessly amusing before eventually setting the record straight. Yes, they had picked a man considerably older than me. They thought I needed a mature hand to guide me, but he was new to the game. A recently ordained vicar of 26 who was settling into a village parish not more than a stone's throw from our own village. Well, that's not so bad, I thought. I'll admit now that, which I would have been denied back then, I felt intimidated. I'd never been alone around a man as old as that until then, and the conditions were all new. Formalities in place of a simple romp, a measured pace over a frantic one. We first met in a local tea room. I sat nervously by the bay window when I saw him roll up in a red convertible MG. I couldn't believe what I saw. Thick, black, curly hair and a rather handsome face. Unlike the younger chaps I'd known, his face was maturer as you'd expect. Gone was the baby fat, replaced by well-defined bone structure. He reminded me of Rock Hudson, a rather uncanny observation in hindsight. When he said that he was interested in getting to know me and asked me to talk a bit about myself, I quickly realized there hadn't been much to tell. Well, not the kinds of things you can discuss with a man of the cloth anyway. When I managed to steer the conversation back to him, I breathed a sigh of relief. I found that he was originally from Middlesex, and to my young mind, that was some kind of sign, because I had a grandfather who was born there. His name was Jack, but his friends knew him as Rupert because for a brief stint, he'd had a bash at being a rowdy teddy boy, velvet collar included. In keeping with that, like me, he was fond of rock and roll, a fan of Bill Harley and his Comets, but an even bigger Elvis fan. He said he would go and see him in concert if he even toured in the UK. I impulsively said I'd go with him. I would have regretted that had he not smiled. He was an excellent conversationist. He made it feel as easy as breathing. I was becoming more and more taken with him until he mentioned that he had a dog, a Labrador called Sally. Oh dear, I thought. I never liked dogs and they didn't seem to think much of me. As a child, I got bulldozed by a Great Dane and was left crying for Mater. I thought if we were to end up living together, the dog would have to go. I wasn't going to run myself ragged chasing a dog around for any man. I asked him why he became a vicar and soon found myself enthralled by him once again. He told me that his life hadn't been easy, that it had presented him with unusual challenges, and that he was on a spiritual quest to find answers. His interest in Christianity had been triggered by an uncle of the Greek Orthodox tradition. He said there was something inspiring, almost mystical about the man's devotion to his faith. From there onward, Jack, or Rupert, decided to dig deep into Christianity and see if he could find a home in it. He eventually found that in the most dependable of Protestant traditions, the Church of England. With the first date being largely a success, we became a courting couple and in the end did end up living together. We were married almost a year after first meeting in a rather subdued affair, and then it was just a matter of starting a new life in the next village over. The vicarage was quite a fine home, not grand but large enough for 2 and a few guests. We didn't have a honeymoon as we both agreed to save money, so our marriage was consummated at the marital home. It's clear he knew what he was doing, but the experience somehow didn't sit quite right. As it also happened, after a few weeks, I managed to persuade him to donate the dog to a local family. What a fuss he made over an animal. The dog whined as it was being taken, causing my dear husband to weep. I said, "Good God, man, get a grip. It'll have forgotten about you within the day." And they say men are the rational sex. I fancy that I made a rather good vicar's wife. I took messages, baked bread, made tea for visiting parishioners, and offered friendly chit-chat. I quite enjoyed the sense of role-playing that it brought. I felt I was acting the part, playing a character, one so completely at odds with my natural inclinations. Then I would sometimes just let loose and go off on a jaunt to the nearest town and head for the dance hall. It was like rediscovering myself every single time. One thing I didn't enjoy much was the routine. I put up with it just as I'd done in school, but I preferred to live life by the minute. I knew all our parishioners by name, and it never took long for me to learn a new one, as was the case with Mr. Glover, a young writer who had just moved into Pear Tree Cottage. He was quite an unappealing fellow, if truth be told, veering towards ugly with the strangest gait I've ever known. I always had to contain myself whenever I saw him walking. Every so often, we'd hop in the car and visit my parents for Sunday lunch. Oh, my parents adored him. My father saw a dependable husband for his daughter, and my mother saw a well-mannered, cultivated man who fit the family perfectly. Sometimes I wondered if I should just stay at home and leave them to it. The three of them seemed perfectly content in each other's company. One such afternoon, my parents brought up a topic that definitely brought me to the center of attention: children. It was bad enough that I was having doubts about our compatibility in the marital bed without unsubtle allusions to the act by my parents. I should have anticipated it though. My parents were always to the point about anything. So when they asked, rather imperiously, when we were going to start having children, I just wanted the ground to swallow me up. To make matters worse, Jack was not his usual extroverted, confident self. He recoiled at the question, shriveled like a prune. We both ended up skirting around the question, giving vague, formless answers. My parents couldn't hide their disappointment at our lack of rigorous baby planning. After that, I remember thinking that my dear Rupert would probably have much preferred a visit from Mr. Glover. As it happened, he visited the vicarage quite a lot. He and my husband were ardent detective fiction fans. The usual suspects, Christie, Holmes, Sayers, and so they were keen to discuss this or that book that they'd read. I had read and enjoyed a few such books, but never quite held the same insatiability for them, so I rarely chimed in on such conversations. It got to the point that I became bored silly with sitting around on Friday evenings, listening to them infuse without abatement, that I made that my dancing night. A few months later, I came home early one Friday evening because my heel had snapped. As I walked towards the house, I saw that the bedroom light was on and the curtains were closed. At first, I thought nothing of it. I assumed he was probably looking for some book stashed in his bedside cabinet, something to lend Mr. Glover. But then I saw two shadows scrambling around where the bed was. I was livid. My husband had invited some floozy into our home and was playing away with her. I had been entirely faithful to him throughout our courtship and marriage, and here he was behaving like a dog. I crept up to the front door and opened it as quietly as my shaking hands could manage before slipping into the hallway. I was dumbstruck by what I heard. Two groaning voices, and they were both male. I felt angry, betrayed, and confused. I had heard of homosexuals, but I'd never before encountered one, let alone had any idea that I'd been living with one for months. When that realization hit, I felt sick to my stomach. He'd betrayed me in the most immoral of all fashions, and I was no more than a blind lamb. I found some nugatory consolation in knowing the infrequent, odd hooking up was not, as I'd feared, my fault. No, he was choosing to cavort with other men. Even now, writing that makes my skin crawl. At first, I didn't know what to do. I daren't tell my parents because, for one thing, it would be humiliating. And for another, I couldn't fathom how my father would react. He might have gone and done something rash and gotten himself into trouble. I couldn't yet leave either because I hadn't had the means to do so. After some thought, I decided there was only one course of action. I would bide my time. I'd have to live more frugally for a while in the name of saving my modest income for a very rainy day. It was like pulling teeth. A year and a half of pinching pennies, of pretending that I knew nothing and felt affection for this man. I made no attempts to be romantic with him, but remained outwardly civil, an arrangement which seemed to suit him. I wasn't a highly religious woman, but I did believe in the importance of law, so I knew what the just thing to do was. But first, I had to make sure my signal was transmitted at just the right time. For that to happen, I had to study the interactions between my husband and his ghastly enamorado. I thought it would be a simple matter in the beginning because there had been a regularity and consistency in them. But then I caught wind of Mr. Glover's new job. Writing wasn't sustaining him, he said, as a salesman. Well, that was all I needed. He had jammed a whopping spanner in the works. Now their get-togethers were much more sporadic, every other week, perhaps a Friday or a Wednesday. I felt like I was back at square one, stuck. My frustration got the better of me during that dark period. I was quite short with him at times, snapping at him for, in hindsight, relatively trivial matters. But then, as if by divine intervention, I had an idea whilst lazily skimming through one of his Poirot books. I could trap him, both of them. One morning over breakfast, I told Jack that I would be joining an evening class with a friend. His eyes lit up. He pretended to be interested, asking me what and when. I told him that it was an art class on Tuesday evenings and that it would be quite late. I thought the later, the better, because Mr. Glover was more likely to have finished work and be free to visit. Jack beamed at me and I could have slapped him. From my vantage point, he may as well have been waving a flag bearing the word fool in my face. A truly depraved and remorseless man. To make sure that everything would go to plan, I waited 3 weeks. 3 Tuesdays, dragging myself to a concealed spot to watch the house. Every time, to my simultaneous repudiation and relief, I saw the bedroom light illuminated and two shadows interacting behind the curtain. Like clockwork, I turned the other way almost as soon as I saw them. There were two reasons I waited so long to move forward. Firstly, it was a matter of nerves. The severity of the situation and all senses was not lost on me. I was going to be a single woman in the wild after so long in a stable relationship. I felt that I could never face my parents for the embarrassment, and last and definitely least was the matter of Jack and Mr. Glover. The other reason was a timing issue. I would have to get to the little police station in a larger village a few miles north, as there was no working telephone box in our village, and I wasn't about to air dirty laundry on a neighbor's phone. No, that would have never have done. I wanted to retain anonymity too, if possible, and I couldn't very well do that in front of a neighbor. So, before leaving, I called the aforementioned friend who'd been made aware of the situation to check she would still drop by and pick me up for class. I stood outside, essentials packed into an overnight bag, and waited for her. When I saw her Morris Minor's headlights peer around the bend, I found my anxiety rocketing. The friend in question was a pal from my school days. Her name was Florence, and she had the most wonderful taste in soft furnishings. As a wedding gift, she had given us a splendid tablecloth that she had made herself. It was a simple rose design, but ever so elegant. By contrast, I lacked the island for that sort of thing. She always had been a good friend. Flory, an absolute rock. She drove me to the police station and then waited for me. I went in and found a stocky officer at the desk. Even there, I didn't want to say it in the open, so I asked if there was somewhere discreet we could talk. I told him the matter was highly sensitive. He was very obliging. He sat me down in an interview room with a cup of tea and invited me to take my time. I said I must tell him as soon as possible or it might be too late. He gave me the oddest look, but then I explained that my husband was a homosexual engaging in sodomy with a neighbor. It was quite surreal to say out loud. Officer Stevens' face became unreadable, told me to stay put, and that he would send someone to investigate as soon as they could. It looked like my hopes of anonymity were slipping away. The wait was torturous, but eventually after about 3/4 of an hour, Stevens reappeared with the news. The discomfort on his face suggested bad news to me. He must have been too late. The dirty duo must have finished before they got there. Alas, I was wrong. The discomfort was the officer having to relay that, yes, my husband and his lover had been caught red-handed, naked, and their depraved version of copulation. The pair of them had been taken into custody. After an interview, I was allowed to go. When I got into the car, I apologized to Flory and asked her if I may make a further nuisance of myself. I told her that I'd like to drop by the vicarage and pack a proper case. Dear Flory, she obliged. Even after all that waiting, she showed no signs of annoyance at being asked to essentially go around in circles. I didn't stop long. I didn't even want to be in that bedroom at all, let alone so soon afterwards, but I knew I might not get another chance. I packed the case into the boot of her car, and off we went to town, where I stayed with her until I knew what was what. Both of them were charged for their buggery, and I was cautiously pleased. It became clear that I'd have to take part in a trial, which isn't at all what I wanted. For all the things that had gone wrong though, there was a silver lining in that my parents would not be attending. In fact, they likely wouldn't know anything of it until it was over, because they were on a touring holiday on the continent. The trial was short and damning. His defense had tried to insinuate some twisted conspiracy from my recollection of waiting and watching, but mine and the attending officer's testimonies were really quite cementing. When it was time for the verdict, I felt confident that justice would be served, and it was. Jack and Mr. Glover were convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Jack went down quietly, looking quite resigned, but Mr. Glover made a terrible fuss. He was practically dragged down. As soon as I'd packed up, I thanked Flory and her husband for letting me stay and departed for the train station. I was going to head for London. When I got there, I used much of my savings buying a cheap flat and set about looking for work. It was dull, but I eventually got a job as a librarian. Good grief, if you told my younger self that I would have ended up being a vicar's wife and then a librarian, I would have laughed myself silly. Preposterous, I would have exclaimed. Fortunately, life got a bit more interesting from the day I met Charlie, the man who would become my second husband. Still waters run deep was a phrase made for men like Charlie. On the outside, he seemed quite normal and placid. On the inside, though, I discovered there was a heart of great passion and adventure. I was more cautious second time around, so it was just over 2 years before we committed. Some years later, I received a letter from Jack. He wanted to meet me in a cafe in Fulham to discuss things that should have been cleared up back then. I vacillated over what to do, but in the end, I decided that I no longer bore any bad will against him. I had moved on, found the love of my life, so I no longer had any reason to be displeased. In fact, if anything, I should be ironically a little pleased with him, for if it had not been for Jack, I would never have met Charlie. So, I decided to go. When I got there, I found it was quite a rustic, bare-bones sort of establishment. There was a radio playing a hit by a newly famous band called The Kinks. Sitting at the table nearest the counter, looking rather rugged and weathered, was Jack. He'd grown a beard. I went over to the table and sat opposite him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. In the end, I decided to cut the silence. I don't for a minute regret what I did. What you were doing was illegal, but I should like to make it clear that I have no bad feelings towards you now. What's done is done. You've served your time, and I've moved on. He said, "You what? You bear no bad feeling? You? I'm the one who got sent to prison for just having feelings. Feelings that aren't even bad. They don't hurt anyone." I say the law disagrees, and the Bible for that matter. They say to heck with the Bible, to heck with it all. The church turned its back on me after what you did. Apparently lessons of redemption don't apply to so-called criminals like me. I said I didn't do anything. I was starting to get quite riled. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, made me feel foolish. They say, and having me locked up in a tiny cell for 2 years, sharing a space with all manner of villains and permanently ruining my life, that's the appropriate response, is it? I say, you must be doing something for work. They say, I wasn't talking about that. I say, then what? He says, Eric. He hung himself a few weeks into his sentence. I'll admit now that I did feel somewhat put out by this revelation. However, it didn't change the fact that he wittingly partook in an affair with my husband. Well, that's it. I hope you found it as intriguing as I did when I first read it. You see, I did actually know that my mother had been married before she met my dad, Charlie, but no clue whatsoever that the marriage was so crazy. All she ever said was that he was a vicar and that they weren't compatible. I'd ask you not to judge my mother too harshly. Some of her attitudes may seem a touch dated now, but she was a product of her time. And in fairness, she had been cheated on by her husband. I can attest to the fact that she was a brill person and mother, very caring and involved. She was the kind of person who would go well out of her way for a stranger and loyal to a fault. Right until the end, she was a very passionate woman and held people to a high standard. I like to think that she made the world a better place. For anyone that's interested to know, I did do a bit of homework and discovered that Jack's life didn't turn out too badly in the end. He found a lifelong partner, entered a civil partnership as soon as the option became available, and then married him when gay marriage was legalized. They had a couple more years together before Jack passed. So, in the end, you could say everything worked out for all involved. There's a number of dramatic portions like this in her memoir. There's none who lives so powerful as the passionate. So, in theory at least, would you be interested in reading an autobiography of this? I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this portion of it. I've already shown a few close friends, and it's generally been well received, though I do think one friend was overly critical of my mother's response. Anyway, I digress. I thank you all for your time and consideration in advance. It's much appreciated. So, considering everything that went down here, how very much a product of the times it seems this experience was, would you ever be interested in hearing more of this memoir? Or was it just a bit too much to stomach? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another revenge story that was crazier than this one, click on that left video. Or if you missed my latest video, click on the right. That said though, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.